Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our online service this morning. We are in week number 4 of our series Signs, where we are looking at the miracles of Jesus as recorded by John. And these miracles tell us something about Jesus, about his power and authority and uniqueness, about his love and his mercy and his grace. And today we are looking at the miracle of the blind man, the healing of the blind man. And so we're going to be talking today about physical blindness and physical sight, as well as, and more importantly, spiritual blindness and spiritual sight. And before we dive into today's narrative, I want to remind us of the purpose for which John recorded these miracles for us. He tells us at the end of his letter why he has shared these miracles with us. So we read in John 20, verse 31, "But these signs, these miracles, are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." John says, I'm not writing these things to you so you simply know what happened, but rather you would know who Jesus is, that you would look at the evidence and then believe in him. And by believing in him, by trusting him, placing your faith in him, you would have life eternal. And today, as we look at today's story, but as you look at John's letter as a whole, the gospel as a whole, it really could be called the gospel of belief, because as John lays out for us the life of Jesus and his teachings and his miracles, we find that some people believe and there are others who don't believe. So John's acknowledging that people can see the same evidence and they come to a different conclusion about Jesus. And so John wants us to see the evidence, look at it, and believe in Jesus so that we could have life in his name. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to John chapter 9 as we look at this miracle, the healing of the blind man. And may God speak to you this morning. John writes for us beginning in verse 1. "As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" So as Jesus was exiting the temple, he's in Jerusalem, he's been at the temple, and as he's exiting the temple out through one of the gates. And today, if you were to go to Jerusalem, in the area, former area of the temple, there are the gates. He goes out one of the gates, and there is a blind man. And in Jesus' day, blind people were reduced to begging for the most part. And so here's a blind man. And his disciples, maybe they've seen this man a number of times because they've been to Jerusalem and the temple a number of times. But they see this man, and so they ask Jesus the question, "Jesus, this man's suffering, his blindness, is it a result of his sin or his parents' sin?" The teaching in the culture in that day from the religious leaders was that if you are suffering, it's because you deserve it. Jesus responds, and here's the teaching of Jesus. Verse 3, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Jesus says not all suffering is a result of our behavior. It's simply we live in a broken world, a fallen world. So Jesus says it wasn't his parents' behavior and it wasn't his behavior, but there's another reason for it. And I don't say this in a trite manner, but this is what Jesus says. He says this man, his suffering, his blindness, is so that the power of God, the works of God, might be displayed in him. So we know that this blind man's suffering had a purpose. We know that Jesus' suffering and his death on the cross for us had a purpose. And we can know in our worldview, in our framework, in our narrative, that our suffering too has a purpose. We may not understand or recognize or see that purpose until, as we know in part now, one day we will know fully, but until the day when we see Jesus. So we might not know, but there is a purpose, which means in our controlling worldview, we as followers of Jesus never ever allow ourselves to live in despair. We have this hope, and there's a purpose for our suffering. So Jesus explains that it wasn't this man or his parents' behavior, but rather so that God may work. And then Jesus goes on to say this, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. We, myself plus you disciples, plus my followers down through the centuries, that we're to do the works of the Father while we still have time, while it's still day. And Jesus then is going to do one of his works that will bring glory to the Father. But before he does, he makes a statement as to who he is. Again, his miracles authenticate who he is, who he claimed to be. His miracles give evidence or support to who he says he is. So what's his claim here? Well, he has a man that's in physical blindness. But Jesus is going to talk to us as well about spiritual blindness. So he makes this claim. Verse 5, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. In other words, this world and humanity is in darkness, but I'm the one that can open eyes, give spiritual sight. I am the light of the world. When Scripture speaks of darkness, there are two key senses. The first one is darkness that refers to our sin and our guilt. The second sense is darkness refers to our ignorance, our confusion. We're in the dark about things. And Jesus says, in all matters, I am the light of the world. That I am the only and unquestionable source of all truth in all matters. So when it comes to God, humanity, life, death, heaven, hell, sex, money, work, race, relationships, parenting, marriage, singleness, Jesus says, I'm the truth. I'm the ultimate reality. Everything aligns with me. That means in our culture, and we've kind of moved from a postmodern culture to a post-truth culture, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the postmodern culture said there is no such thing as absolute truth or objective truth. And that's why we hear things like this. Well, I have my own truth for me. Or here's what I think. Or the way I see it. Or, well, I've always believed. And so in our culture, there's this controlling narrative that we define our own truth. Truth about heaven, truth about hell, truth about sex, truth about money. But Jesus says, I trump all of those views, all of those opinions. I am the light of the world. And now he's going to prove this claim. He's going to illustrate it for the disciples and really for us. It's like Jesus saying to John, 2,000 years from now, there's going to be some folks around the Elmira region. You don't know where that is, but they're going to read this story about what I've done. So please take some good notes here. So here's what Jesus says or does. Verse 6, after saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. So they go through one of the temple gates. Jesus, the disciples point out this blind man to Jesus, and Jesus is going to illustrate that he is the light of the world. He goes to the dirt. He spits on the dirt, and with his saliva makes some mud, and then he puts it on the blind man's eyes. Now, why did he do that? We have no idea. He's Jesus. He does what he wants to do, as long as it's in accordance with his character. Verse 6, go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. So the man goes from the gate to the pool of Siloam, which is in Jerusalem, because Jesus told him to go. And this man literally walks by faith, not by sight. He goes to the pool, washes, obeys what Jesus said to do, and he comes back seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. Now, put yourself in the shoes of his neighbors and those who knew him. Never in human history had someone that was blind had their eyes opened. At the time of Jesus, there are a number of people that were blind, and Jesus heals this man, and he'll later heal some other blind people, and we'll hear a song shortly about that. But Jesus, nobody had ever healed a blind man up until the time of Jesus. And you go back to the time of Moses, where people are blind, and it's referenced there. And so this is a shock. This is like, what is going on here? And this man insists, no, it's really me. I can see. I can just imagine with some of those that knew him say, how many fingers am I holding up? Really? And he insisted that he was the man. Verse 11, answering their question, how did this all happen? He replied, the man they called Jesus. Now we're going to note the clarity of Jesus, the progression of clarity in this man's eyes of who Jesus is. He begins with, the man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where's this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Now if this story was made into a movie, this is where the soundtrack changes. Pharisees Sabbath. Things are going to take a turn here. Verse 15. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Now, a few things here. Jesus did not keep the Sabbath according to the Pharisees. Jesus kept the Sabbath, but not the Pharisees' version of it. The Sabbath was given to us as a gift from God, a day to be restored and renewed, a day to just enjoy God and all that he is in his creation. And if you're not taking a regular Sabbath, one day a week, where you're just downshifting and enjoying God and just taking a break physically and from work, you're not being the best version of yourself. So it was a gift from God. But the Pharisees took this gift and they added a whole bunch of laws to it so that the Sabbath became oppressive. And there were so many rules that you had to follow on the Sabbath. And one of the laws was you could not heal on the Sabbath. So if you had a loved one that was sick, you couldn't do anything to make that loved one better on the Sabbath. Now, if your loved one was near death and almost about to die, you could prevent your loved one from dying, but you couldn't make him better or her better. You could only kind of like neutralize them and wait for the next day. Just ridiculous laws. And so Jesus, he's not going to keep those laws. But notice this. The Pharisees are looking at a man who was born blind, and they've got his testimony as well as others that know him, and now he can see, and they're refusing to look at the evidence. Their mind is already made up. He's not from God. This is supposed to be an investigation of this miracle, and we heard of the miracles, other miracles he did during Passover. It's supposed to be an investigation with open minds, but instead, their controlling worldview narrative had no room for Jesus other than that he was a sinner. He was of the devil, not of God. He had demons. He was insane. They refused to acknowledge what they saw before them. They refused to see this man who now had his sight. They were blind. Francis Collins, if you recall, we were talking about him a few weeks ago, who was an atheist, a scientist who was an atheist, became a follower of Jesus, put his faith in Jesus. But in his book, The Language of God, he refers to willful blindness, refusing to look at all the evidence. And in science, that can happen, where I've got my narrative and it's called confirmation bias. I'm just going to look at what confirms what I already believe. Some would not change their minds, but others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. If he really is a sinner, how is he able to do this? Because they knew Isaiah 42:7, which said that the Messiah, the one that was promised by God to come, would open the eyes of the blind. No one had done that in human history. And now before them, Jesus had done that. And they had questions. Just a note too, we are not immune from having a closed mind where we don't look at all the evidence. As followers of Jesus, we ought to be seekers of the truth because we're following the one who is truth, the one who is the light of the world. So we're always wanting to investigate and we're not afraid to pursue the truth. We're excited about the truth. So in myself, as a follower of Jesus, in my controlling worldview or narrative or framework, I've looked at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which is the miracle of all miracles. Jesus actually rose from the dead, that he is who he says he claims to be. He is the Son of God, God in human flesh. And so I take his word as truth. Now, as I look at Scripture and his word, I see clusters of miracles, three in particular, the miracles around the time of Moses and Joshua, the miracles around the time of Elijah and Elisha, and the miracles around the time of Jesus and the disciples. And I have to work through those miracles. And yeah, I'm looking at the context and how it was written years ago. But I'm to be pursuing that. I'm not simply to say, well, I just believe in miracles and I don't want to hear, your side of your version of how that couldn't happen. Let's look at the evidence. Let's have an open mind and try to see what actually happened. And parents, please understand that your child today is being raised in a post-truth culture. Previously, we were in a postmodern culture, which said that there was no such thing as objective truth or absolute truth. With the post-truth culture, it says that there may be truth, but any truth is subordinated to my personal preferences and opinions. So in our culture today, we accept arguments based on how we feel and our preferences, as opposed to whether it's true or not. And if something we don't quite like it, we deem it as offensive. So for example, Jesus states in his word that race is sacred, life is sacred, sex is sacred. And in our culture's dominating, controlling worldview, race is sacred, but life is not sacred, and sex is not sacred as well. And so any truth claims are then deemed offensive. And so we need to remind our children that if Jesus really rose from the dead, he is who he claimed to be, and that he is the light of the world, and he is truth. He embodies truth, which means he trumps any culture's opinions and preferences. So Jesus said, I am the light of the world, and I'm going to show that or support that claim, and I'm going to open the eyes of this blind man. And he heals this blind man. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. So they want the parents to come in to try to confirm his identity because they believe it's a case of mistaken identity. So they asked for the parents. And is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he has been born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. Now think of the parents for a moment. Their son, who was born blind, can now see. I mean, this is a cause for celebration. They distance themselves from Jesus, from the miracle, and from their son. Why did they do that? John tells us, verse 22, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders Now note this, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. These religious leaders, these Pharisees, had already decided that if you confess that Jesus was the Messiah who could open the eyes of the blind, you would be put out of the synagogue. They had passed a law, which meant you were excommunicated from the community. You were cut off from God and from the community. You were a leper. You were an outcast. And their fear of man, of these people in their culture that were controlling the narrative, they were fearful of saying anything against them that they would not identify with Jesus, the miracle, or their son. Ask him. He's of age. Note this, though, about the Pharisees. They already had made up their mind. To this man, there's an increasing clarity as to who Jesus is. But to the Pharisees, because their minds are closed to Jesus and evidence, there's an increasing hostility. They're supposed to be investigating, but they're not investigating. Their minds are made up. Facts don't matter. They've already made up their mind. And shortly, they're going to be taking Jesus to Pilate and asking that he be crucified. Verse 24, a second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. They were not buying his testimony that he really could see. So they kept probing, not because they were looking for the truth and seeking the truth, but because they wanted to get another reason to discredit Jesus. And notice, they hated Jesus so much, they wouldn't even say his name. We know this man is a sinner. Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. I don't know everything about him. I don't know everything about the situation, all that's going on. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see. He's standing before these Pharisees, and he's referring to his physical sight. I couldn't see physically. I was blind, but now I can see physically. I can see. In a few moments, he's going to be standing before Jesus. And spiritually, he's going to be able to say, I was blind, but now I see. He really speaks the anthem of millions upon millions of people around the world down through time who can say, I was blind, but now I see. Recently, I just watched the movie Just Mercy. It is a movie based on the book Just Mercy, which came out a number of years ago. Great book. But the movie is about Brian Stevenson, who is a follower of Christ, a Christian. And years ago, he graduated from Harvard Law School. And really, it was a calling from God. He went down to the South to represent people who couldn't afford adequate counsel. And so he makes his way and he meets a number of people and begins to look at their cases. And one man in particular, his case is really the basis of this book. And in the basis of this book and the movies. And in this movie, this black lawyer is representing a black man who is wrongfully accused of murdering a white woman. And he was actually sentenced by the judge to death. So he was on death row. And so Brian Stevenson comes in and he begins to look at the evidence. And he realizes that there really is no evidence for convicting this man. It's a fabrication. And he begins to dig and more evidence comes up. And it's so clear that this man did not commit the murder. And so an appeal is made. And appeal after appeal is made. And eventually there is a retrial. But during the movie, with all of this evidence, these people that had convicted him, many of them would not change their mind. And it was that point in the movie where I was like, and my wife will testify, I've got an extra dose of the justice gene. If something is not quite right anywhere, I can point it out and say, this needs to be made right. And yes, I hope that person receives the grace of God and we want them to be made right, but we need to make things right. And so this part of the movie, I'm hoping that Brian Stevenson, as he's talking with some of these guys who won't look at the evidence, and a man's on death row, They won't look at the evidence. I'm waiting for him to kind of lean in on them. Okay, he's a Christian. He's got to be full of grace and truth, but really kind of lean in with the truth, like kind of, give it to him in a Christian way. You'll have to watch the movie to see what he does. But in our story with this blind man, that's what he does. He leans into the truth. He, in a sense, schools the Pharisees. Verse 26. Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen." Look, I laid out the evidence. You can see me. I can see. Hold up how many fingers and ask me how many fingers you're holding up. I can see. But you're refusing to listen. Now, to really understand what's going on here, you have to understand the power balance. I mean, in this culture, these religious leaders had all the power. What they said, you did. This man was a blind man who was a beggar. He was at the bottom of the ladder. And yet he is looking at them and saying, "Why aren't you listening to me?" And then he says this, or asks this, "Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Now, could you imagine that? These people who in their worldview saw Jesus, he was a sinner, he had demons, he was of the devil. And this man is saying, "Hey, do you want to follow him too and follow his teachings and live your life according to him?" Verse 28, then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, and this part, if it's a movie, I'm standing up cheering. I'm like, okay, let him have it. The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. You know Isaiah 42:7. Nobody's ever done it. The Messiah will do it. He's done it for me. Isn't it obvious? If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? You deserved to be born blind. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out of the temple, out of the synagogue, out of the community. Question: what is better? To be part of a community without Jesus, where you're accepted, or to be cast out of that community and have Jesus? This man identifies with Jesus. Today, there are still people that are identifying with Jesus and are cast out of the community, or have been cast out of the community. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him. Now that speaks to us. Jesus is somewhere else, just in Jerusalem or just outside. Word gets to him about this man that he's been cast out. This blind man who's been healed is now a leper, in a sense. And Jesus, God of compassion, finds him. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Which is a title from Daniel 7. It's a messianic title. Do you believe in the Messiah, in the Son of Man? "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. This man had seen the power and authority of Jesus, so his heart was open to what Jesus was saying. "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." This man who couldn't see his whole life, on this day he's given sight. His eyes are opened by Jesus, and now he's looking at Jesus, the Messiah. Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Increasing clarity of who Jesus is. The man they call Jesus, the prophet, to I'm his disciple, to he's sent from God, to Lord. He worships him. and he's willing to gladly bear the reproach of the Pharisees. Same evidence. He believes. And many of the Pharisees didn't. They rejected this man, the miracle. They rejected Jesus. Facts didn't matter. Not too long after this, Jesus is going to stand before these men again in the Sanhedrin, just prior to him being nailed to a cross. And he's on trial, and he'll be looking up at them with the power. And they ask him this question: are you the Son of Man? Are you the Messiah? And he responds to them with this: if I tell you, you will not believe. Sobering words. If I tell you that I really am, it's still not going to change anything. You've seen my miracles. You've seen me. Your minds are already made up. I'm not sure where you are today, if you're a follower of Christ or not, but if you're not yet a follower of Christ, the question is, have you looked at the evidence? Or have you closed the door to Jesus being God, that Jesus rose from the dead? Are you open to pursuing the evidence? Because not all of the Pharisees disbelieved that Jesus was the Messiah. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and later in Acts chapter 6, after the resurrection, the greatest miracle of all, some in this group, they believed in Jesus. And so today, would you pursue the evidence? Look at the evidence for Jesus being who he says he is. And maybe today you're ready to, like this blind man, say, Lord, I believe, and worship him. That you're ready, as John invites us, to read and investigate so that we can believe, and by believing, by trusting in Jesus, we can have life forever in his name. Today could be your day of salvation if you're not already a follower of Jesus. And then from this text, if you are a follower of Jesus, I'd like to share two things. First, as a follower of Jesus, you are called to pursue the truth in science and all the disciplines and all matters of life. You're to pursue the truth because he is the truth. He's the light of the world. And as you do that, you're going to encounter people who have a different controlling worldview and narrative. And you may hear things like, that's not my thing. What you got, that's not my thing. Or, I don't believe that stuff. But remind yourself that we're not about things or stuffs or worldviews or doctrines. We're ultimately about a person who is the light of the world, who is truth, who embodies truth. He's the ultimate reality. We too, like the blind man, as we can say, I was blind, but now I see. We too worship Jesus.